All right, so last time we were working on lids. So these are two examples. We were working on lids with gallery. So this is just an example here of a lid, right? Has a gallery space, bloop, plops in there. This is a different sort of lid with a gallery. And then I have my other one, which I lost. Here it is. This is the one that fell into my pot last time. I was able to fish that guy out and get it. Right, so this guy here, right, bloop, plops in there. So the two that we started is this one and that one. And let me get the lid. I forgot. I should have pulled this guy out. We started this guy here, right? We threw this chunky one here. So that is this one here. You can kind of see domed on the inside, and then this, and then today we're going to trim off that blue part and attach a knob. This one here is this guy here. So we started that one. You guys see that too, right? So woohoo! So we're going to trim these guys up. Remember that you could also make lids with flanges, but we're not working on those today. There's another video for that. So here we go. Let's look at the pots that we have ready. We'll move those guys off. We may need to reference these guys back. So I have always, the first thing that's super important is that you make sure that the lids are drying out equally, that everything's drying out about the same, right? So this is about leather hard. And so when I feel this and I say, hey, how dry does that feel? Like I also can feel this. This should feel about the same dryness right now. Why is that? It's so that, remember we started with the same ball of clay when we threw, and now when it's drying, remember things shrink as they dry. So we are gonna make sure that these fit with each other. You see that one already fits pretty good right now. So I don't have to do any adjustment to this lid to make it fit, it just fits. If this lid, for example, was wetter than this would shrink more when it gets to leather. It would just shrink more, and it wouldn't be rattling around when it's misfired. This is fitting like really tight right now. If this pot was wetter, this lid was drier, this pot then would need to shrink more, right? And if I leave the lid on here while it's drying, which we usually do, this pot can bind against the lid because the pot will need to shrink more and it can crack your pot, right? So always like have them about similar dryness. So let's maybe can you come grab this and then you guys can feel them. We'll pass that around. And then we have this guy, which needs some repair work. This guy, let me quickly show you guys this before that goes around. This guy doesn't fit. You guys see that? It doesn't fit. So before we let this pot go away, I'm going to measure the inside width. Let's go top down, and then we will see if we can make it fit. There we go. And then here, let's send these two guys around, and you guys pick them up and open them and look at them, right? So this guy doesn't fit. So the first trick is we need it to fit inside that pot. Now, you see how this guy, if you look at it, how do I make this fit? Meaning, I should probably just trim off some of this outsideness, right? You see that? So I'm going to trim off some of this outside of this pot, of this lid, to make it slide in there. I have the measurement here, right? So we can actually see that it's actually pretty damn close. You see that? It's pretty close there. So I just need to trim off. So I'm using my thumb there to make sure it aligns. So I need to trim off about that much, so not much clay. So if you notice that this guy doesn't stand up on its own, right? So I use what we call like a little chuck, and I can pop, ooh, that chuck isn't good enough, right? You see how this cone doesn't work to hold that up in the air, the trim. So I have this little baby food jar or wherever this jar came from, boop, then it can hold it in there. I just want to make sure that this jar is kind of centered right there like that. Just make sure it's centered. So we're doing this thing called tap centering. If you want, you can watch a video on that. I have a video for that, how to tap center, right? So that you can Google the video. There's lots of videos on tap centering. Why is tap centering so good? Is just look how fast I got that centered, right? So I have a good video on how to do that. So I'm going to use some clay now to hold this down. We have talked about chucks before, right? I am just going to use 2 big blobs of clay to hold this down, right? So that's in place, and now we are going to flip this over and we're going to center this up like this. We're going to center this one in there, and then we're just going to hold it down. I am going to hold it down this way by applying a little bit of pressure from this top here. You see that? I can even wet this lid down a little bit so my finger slides like that. You see that? Because the minute I touch this with a trimming tool, it's going to want to slide off the lid or slide off the jar because the glass is slick. But by pushing down a little bit, I can sit there and trim this to round. Oop, you see how it slid off just a little bit? Oh, come on. There we go. We'll get it. There, I'm going to apply some pressure again, just trim it, because I don't need to trim too much away here. Right, so I'm just trimming this rounded a little bit, taking care of this. So I might as well take care of this bottom here. If you look, there's a little bit of a undercut seam there. Might as well take care of that. Right there. I'm just not gonna really go back. There we go. So here, now since it's here, let's just pull it off and check really fast against the pot lid. Right, so here we go. Let's just pull it back for a second, pull it off. Since it was off center anyways, ooh, it's getting close. You see how it kind of hunkers in there? I'm not too excited about the knob. The knob just looks way too tall, right? And it's not quite sitting down in there. What's happening is it's catching on this part right here. Remember how this is flaring inward? This part right here is catching on that part right at the bottom of that. So I am going to trim this part in a little, but you see how it's clearing, the first part, right? So this part right here is binding. So this part up on top, I do not need to trim any more of this back right there at the top, but I do need to trim some of this part in. So we'll put it back in and we'll center it again. Then we'll trim a little bit. So I'll just use my finger here. If I needed to do a lot of work on this, I would secure it down better, right? Right now I'm just doing this because I'm anticipating that I don't need to do much, right? And it's okay if it keeps like, because I can tap center, I can just get away with doing it this way, right? I can just center it really quick every single time it comes off. So I trimmed off a little bit more. Right? Ooh, we should have had that down a little. All right, so now let's see if it'll fit. I'm hoping it fits enough. Oh, we are so close. It's just barely, right? Just needs to do a little bit more. So my bet is it's right there that I need to trim off, right? So maybe what we'll do is we'll switch over to one of these trimming tools because I eventually need to trim off all these lines that are from the Sureform tool. I'm gonna wet my finger down again, put some water there and just trim this away a little bit, right? You see that, how I'm trimming that away a little bit right there. Right, there we go. I think I'm gonna get it now. Now, how tight do you want your lids to be? That's up to you, right? It's fun to make them tight, especially after you get pretty good at it, right? So I think that's probably getting close. You can see that I started to get some chattering marks from this tool. If you look closely there, you can see some chattering marks. I hate those on this sort of thing. I'm not gonna leave those, so I'm gonna switch to a rib or just a different trimming tool. Right, I'm gonna use this to create a trimming tool. So you see how that quickly I can get it recentered? That is a great thing, isn't it? There we go. And then I'll just quickly start cleaning up. So I'm thinking that I got it now. I'm going to quickly clean off this bottom. Why do I need to do some work on this bottom? Because you can see the wire marks, right? So I'm going to clean those off a little bit. Is that okay? I don't know. Like I'm doing it kind of manually, right? And then we'll take care of it with a sponge here in a second. And then we'll sponge it here in a second. But before we finalize that, we are going to we're going to go back here and look at my pot, right? And see if it fits. My hope is that it fits. Oh yeah. So it's seating down there perfectly, right? You see that, how it's seated now, right? Woohoo. And it looks good. I am going to do some extra work on that. So we now know that both this lid and this lid are seating down just fine. So we're good to go there, but we need to do some work on them. So let's now, remember how we use this jar as a chuck to hold this lid upside down? Well, now we want to do some work on this part, right? So let's do this guy here. I'm going to now use this pot as a chuck for the lid. Why? Because it already fits, right? We know it fits in there perfectly. And you see the thing, I could leave it like this and say, that's my lid. But check this out. You see how that lid is this line here and this lid like bubbles up a little? I could leave it like that. Okay, so let's leave it like that for a second. So let's just think about what we could do with that. This seems right here, this part seems like it's done, like it feels good, right? I can clean this up a little bit, but you see how that like bumps up into the air? That seems like something that's unintentional for me, and I'm not that happy about it. So we are first going to clean up the top of this pot a little bit. So here we're gonna center my pot a little bit. So here we're gonna tap center. Again, give me a second to clean off this clay. We're going to tap center, and I'm mainly going to center for this time. I'm going to center to the outside of this part right here, because that's the first part I'm going to work on is right there. Ooh, this is interesting. It's not quite level. We'll deal with that. All right, so here, so I centered to this. So I'm going to do some work here on the outside. So like this, we push this down like this, woohoo, like that. So I do got to remember that this is pretty high up in the air. So I do have to be aware that if I exert a lot of force on this, it is going to flip the pot over, right? It is going to the pot's going to want to just jump off the bat. So I have to take it easy, right? All right. So then I could just use this rib, and there's a little bump right here. I'll just trim that away. And let's do it over here. I'll do it lefty over here so you can see the clay like coming off of there, right? I'm just trying to smooth out the curve, get it to look exactly the way how I want it to. Right, you can see the clay coming off. I'm doing it back to righty. Right there, so it's getting there. And then I'm feeling down. This part seems okay, so I'm fine with that. There was just a minuscule little bump there I wanted to trim away. I will then, there's a little bit of clay that got in there, so I can use this guy right here. This has a sharp little corner. I could trim this off. I'm not really trying to trim it, I'm just trying to get the clay off. It really kind of stuck in there. While I'm at it, I never really got a good chance to work on this gallery, right? This gallery was cut off, remember? And then I didn't touch it. So I'd love to round this gallery off a little bit. So I'll trim a little bit underneath. Might as well do it now before I get really working. I'll trim a little. Oop, it's getting hard to reach in there with that guy. So I'll reach in here with this guy and I'll trim that off a little bit. And then I'll smooth it out a little. All right, so that's feeling pretty good. Now I'm pretty happy with that. Then let's slap this lid back on. I'm making sure there's no garbage there, and then pop that back in there. So that part is almost done. I'm just making sure that it looks okay, right, for a second. I'm gonna trim just a little bit more off of right there. We'll do it so you guys can see it a little bit. You can see the clay coming off. All right, so that felt, so what was I doing there? I could feel the bump. I couldn't see the bump, but I could feel it with my finger, right, as I was doing that. So I'm gonna do that a little bit more. And then I'm gonna come back with a sponge, which I didn't, can you throw me a sponge here? Thank you, just one, thanks. Perfect, so I'll come back with a sponge here and just wet it down super lightly. Right, you see that? And then I'm gonna smooth it out. Like that, lay that down like that. Here we go. And I'm just trying to get rid of those trim marks. The rest of this down here does not need to be trimmed. I'm fine with the way that looks. So I don't like the way how raw that looks, right? All right, so see how that's all smoothed out now, looking pretty happy. All right, so now let's go back to the lid. There's a couple issues with the lid we should work out. I just don't like how that bubbles over, right? You see that? So, and then remember how I bang this? I still move this a little bit to try to get it on center. All right, so I'm gonna trim this down. What do you mean by that? Because I don't like that this form, you see how that is going up and over just too much. So I'll trim that down a little bit. It's a little wobbly, right? You see that how it's a little wobbly, but you see how I'm starting to trim that down. I have plenty of thickness there. You guys see that? I have plenty of thickness. So I'm still in good shape. So I'm just going to trim down so this matches that. So you see how it's already starting to get there? So this lid looks really purposeful. You also notice that it's kind of wobbly, right? And it's just from the nature of making things. We're not perfect. So we have to kind of account for our just selves being human, right? So sometimes what I'll do is I'll trim it a little bit and I'll rotate that a little bit to see if it still looks good. So it's a little proud now over here on this side. You see that and looks okay there. So I'm just going to try to hold still and trim this side down. My hope is that side, I can trim that side down a little bit more. I'm trying to hold super still. You see how that's looking better? So ideally what I would want is for this form to look kind of continuous across there. I did trim a little bit of a flat spot there, so I'll come back here and attack this a little bit to bring that in like that. You see that, how I'm just trying to make it all look at peace with each other. And then I'll add a little bit of water here. And I will start smoothing this back in. Now, normally I wouldn't make two separate lids, right? I made two separate lids because just to show you two different ways of making lids and two different ways. So normally I would be getting close to done now, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so then you see how that lid and this pot look like they just belong together more, right? I can still pull that off, right? You guys see that? How that just like, boop, it's like, woohoo, right? Like we have always been together for our whole entire lives kind of thing. The knob still looks goofy, and so what I would probably do is I'd probably just cut this knob off and throw a new knob, and I'm not going to show you that on this lid. I would also probably come back and just round this corner off by sponging it. I would get rid of this texture. There's a little bit of chatter texture a little bit. I would get rid of that by ribbing it, but we're not going to do that with this one because those are all easy things to do, because we're going to show you how to throw a knob on this one anyway. So I'm not going to throw a new knob on this one for you because we're going to show you how to throw a knob on this one. All right, so this lid looks a lot like this, right? You see that right now. So let's get these oriented the right way. So that's this disc, the blue part, you see that? And then I'm going to trim this and leave the red part behind. So it's just like this dome lid. So luckily I already have this sitting here. So if I needed to do some work on this side, I would just use this as the chuck. Right, you see that? Or if I needed to do the work before I attach this down, I could just put this straight on the wheel head. And if I needed to do something in here, especially if I needed to trim this in a little bit, right? Sometimes it just don't fit, right? And so you could trim this in a little bit. You can also come back and trim this part out a little bit, but remember that trimming this out, it's not solid clay here. So by trimming this out, you're making this weaker. This, I can trim inward just fine. Does that make sense? So if this wasn't fitting, I could pop it on and just trim this part inward. Does that make sense? So if this part is just a little bit funky, I could trim this out a little bit, but we don't have to do that. All right, so this is getting a little bit messy here. We'll try to clean it out a little. All right, so there, and I pop it on. So now the good thing about this is when I look at it, I can see how it looks with the pot, right? As I'm trimming, I always like trimming these lids on here just like this. Why? Well, just like how we finished this guy, right? You see how when that guy pops back on there, it looks so good, right? We want to do the same thing with this guy here. I have to trim this dome on here, right? Woo-hoo. So I pop it on there and that should hold it down. If your lid is not sticking down, like it's just a little bit dry, wants to keep popping off as you're trimming, just wet this surface a little bit. It will stick a lot better, right? It does make it harder to get off, right? Like you can't just pop it off and look at what's going on. So you can wet it just a little bit put it down, and that little bit of water will stick it just a little bit, but it's harder to get off later. Ooh, this isn't quite fitting in there. It's a little bit, now that I'm feeling it, it's like rattling around a little bit. So we will trim this part in a little bit here, okay? Just to show you, and then it's actually a good thing. It's okay that it's not seated perfectly in there, right? I can still trim it this way, because I only need to trim off a little bit, I think. See that how I'm trimming just a little bit off? Let's see if it seats a little bit better in there. Trying to get as much of that gunk out. Oh, that's so much better. All right. That just needs a little bit. I'll come back and finish that rim later. Oh, this is interesting. Is it not seating level? I'm going to trim off just a little bit more because it just isn't seating in there quite right. I'm just a little bit worried that it's not. So I'm going to use a rib here and trim this a little bit. Let's see. It's actually good when these things happen during a demo, because these are the things that some of the things that you will have to face, right, when you're trimming, when you're working on this. Ideally, right, they fit just perfectly right out of the bat, right? Oh, that's much better. I can just feel it where it's seating. It's just seating a little bit better. So what I think it was just a minusculely, just a little bit too wide, and was just catching right before the bottom, right? All right, so now we get to trim this part right into the dome shape. How high a dome do you get to make? Well, the maximum height of the dome, let's just draw a line here, right, on this, right? So the maximum height I can do is that height, right? That's as much as I want to do, because just like this one, I want the top of this to line up with that. So they look like they came together. There is all sorts of other reasons and why you'll do that. So when I trim this the first time, I'll trim it so that it looks like it's bubbling up, and you'll see that for a second, right? So what does that mean? Because you'll see it, right? So here, I'm just going to start hacking away at this, but you see this is the vertical distance that I get to dome it at. Does that make sense? So this is like there. That's like me putting a line right there. That's how much dominess I get to it, right? For this pot, I could have left this thicker here and domed it downward, right? Does that make sense? So I could have had more vertical height, but if I want a dome that's higher, I can't get more height than what is already here. Like yeah, or something that really perks up into the air, right? Like a whoosha, right? Comes over, kind of like a dunce cap or something, or like a cone or something. You have to have that thrown already, right? Or you have to do a big attachment or something, right? So this dome is going to be pretty flat, right? So we're going to do a couple different versions here as I go. So I'm just going to trim away, and you'll see it start happening as it's going, right? So you see that, how I'm just whittling away the side, right? Trying to get it down. And you could do all sorts of things. You get a million choices, right? Right? This doesn't look quite right yet, so we'll keep going. So woohoo! All right, so I'm going to start working it into the middle now. You see that how I'm starting to move into the center, but I'm starting to create that slope there. You see that? So that it starts to look hopefully pretty good. It's a little bit wobbly, something's up. Oh, I forgot to tell you, haha. One thing you'll notice is that I never trim the bottom of this pot. I leave the bottom the way it is, because that extra mass, that extra weight down there helps hold this up, right? If I trim this and put this little foot on there, it makes this whole thing want to tip over. Right? So I leave that bottom the way it is, and I'll trim the bottom later. That makes sense? So I should have told you guys that at the beginning. This is doing a little bit of a wobble right down there. All right, so we'll do a couple different versions of this. That makes sense for everybody. Here we go. There we go. All right, so you see how this I'm gonna do one version where I don't put that much dome on it, and then you'll see, and I'll get it to a point that makes sense for you guys. So you see though, it's starting to take on that dome shape. Now I gotta switch over to a different tool, and then we'll start trimming this away. So you have to be really gentle, right? You can't be super aggressive in your trimming of these. Why? It's because it's one thing on another tall thing, right, that's held down to the thing. So it's held down to the wheel was just clay. It wants to jump out. So one, have these pieces be really good at babying them to being as they dry out, right? That makes sense? Take it really easy with them when you're drying them. It's better to have them a little bit wet when they're drying rather than a little bit dry, too dry. So this is what I'm doing, right? So for this one right now, I'm going to create this like double thing. So it'll come in, bloop, and then I'll have a secondary like bloop, like dome that's going to be perking up into the air. And this is the way we may leave it. I don't know. We'll take a good look, solid look at it here in a second. Let's switch tool. This one isn't quite up to snuff. Let's switch sides, see if it's better. Oh, that's a little better. But I'm trimming righty. I'm not great at trimming righty, so we'll switch to this guy here. So here we go. There we go. Woo-hoo. All right, so you see I'm trying to trim this so that it has another dome thing going on here, right? So it's up to you to what you want to do, but partially, right, like we said, the issue has been already done, right, as far as what I have available to myself, right, because of the size of and you can see this thing jumping around, right? Make sure it's still in place. All right, so let's take a look at this, right? So that's feeling okay. I think I need to trim off a little bit there. So let's attack it with this tool here. Oh, this tool is doing good. Oop. Starting to make sense, right? Do you see that starting? Ooh, I might as well just go for the whole dome. It's not really doing, there just wasn't enough height to do the perky uppy one, but you can kind of see it starting to happen. So I'm gonna go back to this tool and you can see that I'm just gonna trim a continuous curve all the way around. That makes sense to everybody? So the curve just kind of comes around. So that can only, or it's best to only be done while it's on the pot because I can see how the curve is coming into it, right? And then going around. So I'll just start trimming away at this. This pot is barely wanting to stay in this one spot, right? You guys see it kind of jumping around a little? But don't let that get to you, right? So you see that how it's starting to get all the way around, and then here it's a little bit proud just there. Okay, so we'll see if we can fix that now. All right, so just like how I did before, I'm gonna rotate it, right? So I can't get this out anymore, right? You guys see that? Sometimes I can. If I use my nail and jam it in there, I could lift it out, right? And I'm gonna rotate 180 degrees because you'll see that this side, I haven't gotten down to that line yet, but this side, it's at that line. So I'm gonna rotate it 180 degrees to see if we can get this, if I can get it to trim down this side a little down so it's more even. And it's just the nature of the pot, right? Oh, the other thing I can do is check thickness here, right? So here it's plenty thick. So I can trim this dome downward still. I can flatten out this dome. There's plenty of thickness right here in the middle, right? So if I need to, for the look, I can trim this dome and flatten it out still. So we'll see what we need to do here. But I think it's getting close. And I do end up trimming into this, right, a little bit, my shoulder. So usually we only make one lid work, right? Does that make sense? But now this lid, when I bring this lid back later, it may not look great anymore, right? So I'm now trying to make this pot work for this one. I'm holding it down with my opposite hand. You guys see that? Adding some weight to it to keep it from jumping out. Ooh, it is. So I think I just need to recenter it. It's going all over the place. So we'll stop for a second. It is way off center. I think that's better. We shall see in a second. All right, so now we'll go back to trimming. There we go. So then I'm really checking out how this profile looks. It's looking pretty close, right? You guys see that? How it's just starting to make more sense for what I'm thinking. This side, I know that this side's a little proud, so sometimes I just cheat a little bit and just whittle away that side a little bit more than normal. No one will know, right? All right, so we're gonna keep trimming. Then we'll throw a knob for this. There we go. See how that's starting to make sense? I think that's looking really good. So then we'll come back with this tool here, right? We'll wet this part down a little bit, right? And then we'll smooth all that out. Sorry for that. That's my see that? So I'm really smoothing it out. I know that this edge is not looking great down in there. I'll fix that later. All right, so now I'm ready for my knob. And this is the same process. Like if I don't like this knob on here, I would fix that knob by cutting this off and doing exactly what we're about to do here. So I have a place for a knob right there, right? I can put it on. Now, you can do whatever you want. You can pull a knob, right? You can pull some clay. You could and attach a blob, something, right? Whatever you want to do, but let's throw a knob on there. So you just take some clay, and then this is hard. You can't really wedge this clay, but it needs to be wedged. So you roll it into a coil like 10 times, maybe, like that. You see that, how I just keep, so that is my way of wedging. I'll even do a special move where I put the ends in the middle like that, just to make sure, right? So I do that a bunch of times. So this is me wedging the clay, right? This little piece. This is way too much for a knob, right? And so you want to think about it, like how big a knob do we want? So I'm just going to tear off a chunk, right? So you need more clay, a little bit more clay, but you think about it like, bloop, is that my knob? That would probably be an okay size. So this is the size that I'm going to go with. Take your needle tool here. So we'll just zoom in at the top, right? And then I am going to scratch up this section right here. Woo-hoo! Scratch that up. Right, you see that? And I'll go back and forth a bunch of times. Woo-hoo! Right, you see that? So that is that. I'll blop some water. Bloop, bloop. I'll blop some water. Bloop, 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 bloop. And then what I'm going to do is attach this on there. So that is wet and happy, boop, like that. Stick that on there. Woohoo! And then I'm going to stick this down by doing that, right? That. Right, so that is stuck down there, right? So then I will just go and start centering it, right? So the first thing I do is I smoosh it in from the side like that. So I'm doing centering except on a minuscule level. So I can't get my whole hands in there like I would if I were centering for real, but I can use just my fingertips like that. You see that, the center? So same idea. I'm holding still and centering this little bit of clay, woohoo, like that, up. And then I push it back down. You see that, how it's starting to center? Same principles as regular centering. It's easier to center that bit than to center that bit. So I always make sure that the top bit is centered, and I go down like that. And you can actually see the knobbiness starting to happen just even as I'm centering. Right, you see that? There's another way you could do this, is you could just center off a bigger piece of just centered clay, right? If you're like, John, this makes me super nervous to center on my lid, right? You could just take a big chunk of clay, throw it onto the wheel, and just center this little top chunk and make a knob and cut it off, right? That makes sense? Just before you start throwing something else, and we'll talk about Right there. And then so you see how it's almost centered, and we'll speed it up. So for little pieces of clay, going quickly is good, right? All right, so now this is centered enough. Maybe this part isn't quite centered enough, so we'll just squish that back in. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. So just like when we did this knob here, which ended up too big, right? The same principle, we do the same thing. We work from the top, we work top down. So I make sure the top of the knob is looking good. So what do I want for the top of the knob? One thing, default thing, is you can just look at the top of your pot, like what's going on here, whoop, right? I could try to replicate that here, whoop, right? So I'll just think about that. I'm trying to get a good look at it here, right? Trying to see how that looks, or we'll just create something round and flat a little bit, because this is a little flatter at the top and then slopes down. So maybe that's what we'll do here. Right, and now we have the side, so the top is basically done. I'm not too excited about that, but you'll see now that I'll begin to undercut the knob, right? Like that. Oh, it's usually important you don't get any water dripping down into this space, right? Because that could crack your lid, meaning that if lots of water ends up in this thing, that'll make that area really wet and goopy, and then it could crack your gallery. So you notice that no water has come down into here, just this part. So here, that's the beginning, right? And this is the time, if you already know you don't have enough clay, just cut it off and start over again, right? Now I'm starting to undercut it a little. You see that? Woohoo! So it's starting to squirt up in the air, but I still have enough clay here. I can still make an adjustment to the knob. So I'm to the sides and the top. So I'm making more adjustments, trying to make sure it feels good. Right, and then I'll come back in here. And then what kind of knob do you need, right? Do you just need a knob that is grabbable, right? So this is enough, right, that someone can grab it and feel okay. This pot is not something where someone would put like really hot things in, or need to have an oven mitt, right, when they're grabbing it, or they might burn themselves. This is not going to be like a casserole dish or something where they need an oven mitt to get in there. This knob probably wouldn't be good enough, right? But this is mostly like, I don't know what you're going to put in here, right? So but the knob, it's not important that this be a giant super functional knob that you need to be able to grab a hold of with gloves on or something, right? And then go really fast here near the end, and then it's starting to shape it, just doing a little bit more shaping there, right, along the side. And then, woohoo, I mean, I think it's actually looking okay just the way it is. Let me see. I'm okay with it, right? And then sometimes I can't get my finger in there so good, right? My finger just isn't the right size. So you can get something else, and you can jam this thing in there to kind of, you see how that kind of works, is sometimes I just not comfortable with my finger getting in there. So what happened there is it just dragged a little bit too much. So we can kind of straighten it out. I was just being a little bit too aggressive. So we'll go back to my finger. So it is not round, but no one's ever going to see it spinning, right, ever again. So we're happy with that. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's the knob that I made. And you can see how the knob, I can see it on the pot that's on the lid, right? So this thing will always be usually presented together as one item. That makes sense to everybody? So throwing that knob while it's on the lid, while it's on the pot, while the lid's on the pot, is super important, I think, so that when you back away from it, you see it looks like it should all belong together, right? Another way you could have done it is thrown that knob separately, right? And then you could have cut that knob off, right, off of whatever you did it by just using your needle tool, whoop, and then stick it on, but then you don't know how it's going to look on the pot. You could have also thrown this, you could have attached just the lid to the wheel head and thrown a knob, but then once again, you don't know how it's going to look, right? So now we know that it's going to look fine. Now this knob is super wet, but what else needs to happen here is later on, I'm going to come back and round this edge off a little bit. I'm not going to do it too much now because this knob is super wet. And if I work on this too much, I will take a rib and just manually round that off like that. You see that? How I'm just putting a little roundness there. And then I may come and I may come back here and put the same roundness. Now that I'm thinking about it, roundness here. So I could do that right now. So I can just round this little edge off right here. You guys see that what I'm doing? We'll bring it closer so you can see. So I love putting a slightly rounded thing here. And then this, I slightly round, which side was I rounding? Here, I was rounding this off a little bit. So I love it if those two had the same flavor, right? So I'll sponge this off a little bit. I'll sponge this off a little bit right there so that when this drops on, you see how it can have a similar feel there. This one's looking a little proud. What's going on? So it looks like I need to do a little bit of adjustment there, right to that edge, but that will happen manually later. Or I could do it some now. Let's see here. We'll go back. So I have to use a needle tool to get this off now because it's so it does mean I'm scarring up the edge a little bit, but I can fix that each time. And then so this is the part that I really do wish John Hussegow had a better way of doing this next part, but I do come back and I manually round this corner off. And I just found that, why did I start doing it this way? Because I was hand building lids for a while. And it's just, I do kind of like this part, but it is moving away from the throneness. But I just like the way this feels when it's rounded off a little bit better like that. Remember how that area looked a little bit proud on one side? It was just sticking up a little too much. When you round the edge like this, it helps make that go away, right? And I'll keep rounding this edge a little bit. Keep rounding this edge a little bit, like that. You see that how I'm just taking my time, like that, and then I will come back in through and with my sponge and try to sponge it off. Now I do a little bit more maintenance work here on the side here too, normally, but we won't have you guys sit through all that. Then we'll spend some more time with this here. And then we'll plop that back down. So it's starting to get, ooh, you see how it's starting to feel better now it just feels better, looks better. It isn't trying to, but also that shape does continue across, right, at the same time. So it's acknowledging, it puts a slightly bigger seam there. It allows that seam to roll down into the lid and allows this seam to roll into that. We'll try picking up by the lid. No, it's too stuck down. We can't, so we'll have to use this tool. So let's see how this other guy looks before we do it. So this knob here, we would probably just cut it off, right? And then just make a new one. But you can see how this lid looks okay. So which lid do you like better? Right? For me, the scenes, when I was okay with this lid, right? Until I saw this lid on there. And I like that lid much better with this pot for me, right? That makes sense? So it's like trying on shoes or something, right? You may like the first pair of shoes, but that next pair of shoes is even more awesome. So now you like those. You're not even going back to the first pair anymore. That makes sense to everybody? What else needs to happen? So I do need to do some more cleanup on this. I will clean up the inside of Gallery because I do acknowledge that I was trying to work fast. So there's a lot of like garbage that got collected up in here that I should have cleaned out. Then I still got to do some cleanup on the rib, and then I will flip this over and trim the bottom of that later. But we don't have to see that because all I do is I flip this over onto this rim and I trim it. But we always do that last, right? So what is going to happen is I made this part a little too bulgy outy, so that I will trim out some of this weight off of here and then trim a foot underneath there. That makes sense, everybody? Sound good? All right, so try making lids. Woo!